Mary was born on the 8th of December at Linlithgow Palace 1542, in Scotland, to King James V and his French second wife, Mary of Guise. She was said to have been born prematurely and was the only legitimate child of James to survive him. Mary was christened at the nearby church of St. Michael shortly after she was born. Rumours spread that she was weak and frail, but an English diplomat, Ralph Sadler, saw the infant at Linlithgow Palace in March 1543, unwrapped by her nurse, and wrote, "It is as goodly a child as I have seen of her age, and as like to live." She was the grand-niece of King Henry VIII of England, as her paternal grandmother, Margaret Tudor, was Henry VIII's sister. On the 14th of December, 6 days after her birth, she became Queen of Scotland when her father died. There was a popular tale, first recorded by John Knox, stating that James, upon hearing on his deathbed that his wife had given birth to a daughter, said, the crown had come to his family through a woman, and would be lost from his family, through a woman. This legendary statement came true much later, not through Mary, but through her great-great-granddaughter Anne, Queen of Great Britain. As Mary was a 6-day-old infant when she inherited the throne, Scotland was ruled by regents until she became an adult. From the outset, there were 2 claims to the regency, one from the Catholic Cardinal Beaton, and the other from the Protestant Earl of Arran, who was next in line to the throne. Beaton's claim was based on a version of the king's will that his opponents dismissed as a forgery. Arran, with the support of his friends and relations, became the regent until 1554 when Mary's mother managed to remove and succeed him. In July 1543, representatives of both England and Scotland came together and agreed on a new treaty. This was to be called the Treaty of Greenwich. It contained 2 agreements. The plan was set out by King Henry VIII with a prospect to unite both countries in a union. Part 1 would include a way to establish peace, the second was to betroth Henry's son Edward to Mary. The suggestion was to have Mary move to England and be cared for by an English gentleman and his wife until she reached the age of 10, she would then continue to reside until the time of her marriage. Although the treaty was signed by the Earl of Arran, it would be rejected by the Scottish Parliament on the 11th of December 1543. The outcome led to what was known as the Rough Wooing, and would lead to 8 years of Anglo-Scottish conflict. After the collapse of the treaty, Mary was sent to France, where she would spend the next 13 years of her life. She was acclaimed as vivacious, beautiful, and clever, and Mary had made a very good impression at the French court and was liked by all, with the exception of Henry II's wife, Catherine de' Medici. But it wasn't all bad. Her future sister-in-law, Elisabeth of Valois, became a close friend, and her maternal grandmother, Antoinette of Bourbon, was another strong influence on her childhood and acted as one of her principal advisors. Mary was an eloquent and forceful lady and stood above many others, not just because of her nature, but she was also tall, and had attained a height of 5 feet 11 inches. Compare that to Henry II's son, who was short and his speech suffered with a stutter. Yet none of this affected Henry's view on the couple, and he said, from the very first day they met, my son and she got on as well together as if they had known each other for a long time. On the 4th of April 1558, Mary signed a secret agreement bequeathing Scotland and her claim to England to the French crown if she died without issue. But within a few weeks he had taken the hand of the Dauphin at Notre Dame in Paris, and he became the King Consort of Scotland. In November 1558, Henry VIII's elder daughter, Mary I of England, was succeeded by her only surviving sibling, Elizabeth I. This threw up more tensions, although under the Third Succession Act, passed in 1543 by the Parliament of England, Elizabeth had been recognised as her sister's heir, and within Henry VIII's last will and testament he had excluded the Stuarts from succeeding to the English throne. This was not the case for Catholics, for they inferred Elizabeth was illegitimate and Mary Stuart was the rightful Queen of England. Their argument stated that Mary, as the senior surviving legitimate descendant of Henry VII, through her grandmother Margaret Tudor, should be crowned the Queen of England. Henry II of France ignored the rise and intensity brought about by this news and proclaimed his eldest son and daughter-in-law King and Queen of England. They were so certain of their claim that in France, the royal arms of England were quartered with those of Francis and Mary. Mary's claim to the English throne would continue to become a major part of her life, and others, especially Elizabeth I. It would be on the 10th of July 1559 Henry II died, and now Francis at 15 and his 16-year-old Mary would become King and Queen of France. Back in Scotland, the power of the Protestant lords of the congregation was rising at the expense of Mary's mother, although she had tried to maintain some sort of control, but had to count upon the help of French troops to keep order. Complications heightened further in early 1560, when the Protestant lords invited English troops into Scotland in an attempt to secure Protestantism. Yet over in France a Huguenot uprising called the Tumult of Amboise made it impossible for the French to send further support. On the 11th of June 1560, Mary's mother died, and so the question of future Franco-Scots relations was now deemed a most pressing concern. It was under the terms of the Treaty of Edinburgh, signed by Mary's representatives on the 6th of July 1560, France and England undertook to withdraw troops from Scotland. Now France at this point recognized Elizabeth's right to rule England. But for Mary, who was still in France and grieving her mother's death, she completely dismissed the treaty. Sadness fell upon Mary in 1560. It was on the 5th of December her husband King Francis II died of a middle ear infection that led to an abscess in his brain. Mary was grief-stricken. Her mother-in-law, Catherine de' Medici, became regent for the late king's 10-year-old brother Charles IX, who inherited the French throne. It would be now that Mary would return to Scotland. Acclimatizing to what was undoubtedly a new country for Mary, with her upbringing in France, it was difficult for her to fully understand what had happened in her home country of Scotland. As now it was a complex and bureaucratic situation that she had to overcome. Doubts and suspicions followed her, especially by members of the court and its subjects, but more importantly by the Queen of England, Elizabeth. It was a torrid time for the Scots. They were completely torn between Catholic and Protestant sides. Mary's half-brother the Earl of Moray was the Protestant leader. However, John Knox, who was a Protestant reformer, had little sympathy for Mary, and condemned her for taking part in Mass. He also complained about her dancing and for becoming elaborately overdressed. Mary asked Knox to present himself. She required to know what justified his remarks, but the meeting proved to be a failure, as Knox was unrepentant. Mary was angered and charged him with treason, but some time later he was acquitted and released. Mary's attention once again turned to that of the English throne. She had failed to appoint anyone sympathetic to her interests in Catholicism, her ongoing interest in French politics, and even the very troubling internal problems now within Scotland. She was struggling to come to terms with Protestant lords and knowing that she had little to no military power to help stop the rise by them. Her eyes now focused once again on the English crown. She sent an ambassador, William Maitland of Lethington, to the English court to put forward her case as heir. Elizabeth, though, was having none of this and refused to name any future heir, but Elizabeth feared possible conspiracies that could remove her from power and give Mary an opportunity to take the throne. So Elizabeth kept her cards close to her chest and explained to Maitland that she knew no one with a better claim than Mary. After the meeting and the promising news delivered by Maitland, Mary now set out to find a new husband. She would initially look for someone with a connection to European royalty. Yet it would be her uncle, the Cardinal of Lorraine, who would start the ball rolling by speaking with Archduke Charles of Austria. Yet this was done without her consent, and her anger was there for all to see, and nothing ever came of her uncle's attempt. Mary then began conversations about the potential of Don Carlos, who was heir to King Philip II of Spain, but this would also end in dismay as Philip himself rebuffed the approach. As for Elizabeth, she tried in vain to place her royal favourite, Robert Dudley I, Earl of Leicester, to take Mary's hand, but although Mary came around to this suggestion, for Dudley, this was never going to happen, even though Elizabeth thought Dudley would do anything for her. There was one man who was completely besotted with Mary. He was a poet at the French court, and without doubt not the high-serving man she wanted. Pierre de Boscozel de Chastelar was so enamored of Mary in 1563, he was discovered during a security search hidden underneath her bed. His thoughts were to jump out when he was alone with her and declare his love. This obviously didn't go to plan. Mary for her part was a little aggrieved and settled the matter by banishing him from Scotland. Pierre though ignored the warning, and just 2 days later he forced his way into her bedchamber. Mary in horror screamed. It would be Moray that came to her assistance, but when entering the room, Mary told him to put his dagger into the villain, but Pierre was already restrained and Moray refused. For Pierre, the end was nigh, and he was tried for treason and beheaded. In February 1561, Mary had a brief meeting with her English-born half-cousin Henry Stewart, Lord Darnley. It was at a time when she was in mourning for Francis. But Darnley shared a recent Stuart lineage with the Hamilton family as a descendant of Mary Stuart, Countess of Arran, a daughter of James II of Scotland. They next met on Saturday the 17th of February 1565, at Wemyss Castle in Scotland. Mary fell in love with the long lad, as Queen Elizabeth called him, since he was over 6 feet tall. It was a friendship that bloomed, and the couple were married at Holyrood Palace on the 29th of July 1565. Although both were Catholic, a required papal dispensation was required, as they were cousins, yet it was not sought by them. English statesman William Cecil and the Earl of Leicester had worked to obtain Darnley's license to travel to Scotland from his home in England. Elizabeth now felt threatened again. Although it was her own advisers that had set up the marriage, she felt this way, because they were descendants, and both could ultimately stake claim to the English crown. By having children, this would certainly cement their claim. The marriage would send repercussions through the English court. Elizabeth was very unhappy, and argued it should not have taken place without her permission. It wouldn't take long for power to go to Darnley's head. He became arrogant and clearly not content with just being a consort. He wanted more. The main demand was to become co-sovereign of Scotland with the right to keep the Scottish throne for himself, if he outlived his wife. Mary refused, which caused the couple to slowly drift apart. Darnley became more frustrated. He wouldn't take it lying down, and his jealousy surfaced when he thought Mary had become more than just close to her Catholic private secretary, David Rizzio, in which it was rumoured he was the father of her child. This all culminated on the 9th of March. A group of the conspirators accompanied by Darnley murdered Rizzio in front of the pregnant Mary at a dinner party in Holyrood Palace. Mary, now completely disillusioned by the whole affair and in a state of shock, didn't know which way to turn, yet Darnley decided to switch sides. Together Darnley and Mary left the palace and took temporary refuge in Dunbar Castle before returning to Edinburgh on the 18th of March. Her movements with Darnley would now be the beginning of the end for Mary. Mary had a son, James, who was born on the 19th of June 1566 in Edinburgh Castle. However, the murder of Rizzio left a sour taste in her mouth, and this single event led inevitably to the breakdown of her marriage. Mary's health suffered and she contracted a serious illness with frequent vomiting, loss of sight, loss of speech, convulsions and periods of unconsciousness. At one point it seemed she would die, but with help from her French physicians she made a full recovery. It would be at Craigmillar Castle, near Edinburgh, at the end of November 1566, Mary and leading nobles held a meeting to discuss the problem of Darnley, a thorn in her side that needed removing. Mary spoke about divorce, but it seems that other measures were also discussed, including the ultimate sacrifice. Darnley, now fearing for his own life, went to Glasgow, where he stayed on his father's estates. In January of 1567, Mary asked Darnley to return to Edinburgh, which he did, and she visited him on a daily basis. It would be on the night of the 9th or 10th February that Mary would see Darnley one last time, before leaving to attend wedding celebrations of a member of her household. Darnley was staying at Kirkerfield, and in the early hours of the following morning a huge explosion was heard. Darnley was found dead in the garden. It looked as though he had been smothered, yet no marks were visible upon his body as to what, or if, he was subjected to any other violence. Almost immediately Mary, along with Bothwell, Moray, Secretary Maitland, and the Earl of Morton, came under suspicion for the murder. It would be Elisabeth that wrote a letter to Mary for an explanation.
I should ill fulfill the office of a faithful cousin, or an affectionate friend, if I did not tell you what all the world is thinking. Men say that, instead of seizing the murderers, you are looking through your fingers while they escape. That you will not seek revenge on those who have done you so much pleasure, as though the deed would never have taken place, had not the doers of it been assured of impunity. For myself, I beg you to believe that I would not harbour such a thought.
Towards the end of February, Bothwell was the man who now many believed was the guilty party of Darnley's murder, yet after a 7-hour trial on April 12, he was acquitted, and within a week, he convinced lords and bishops that he should marry the Queen, to which they agreed and gave support. Troubling times now lay ahead for Mary. In April of 1567, she visited her son for the last time. It would be upon her return to Edinburgh on the 24th she was abducted by Bothwell and his men and taken to Dunbar Castle. She eventually returned to Edinburgh with Bothwell on the 6th of May, and on the 15th they were married under Protestant rites. Mary was secure in the knowledge that her nobles supported the marriage, but tensions rose and soured between Bothwell and his former peers. Catholics were in uproar as they considered the marriage to be unlawful, not believing that Bothwell was either divorced from his previous wife, and more importantly due to the validity of the Protestant service. Yet both religious factions were in shock, just at the thought that Mary would even contemplate marriage with the man who murdered her husband. The pressures were now heavy, and for Mary it was yet another period of crisis in her life. It would be on June 15 that both Mary and Bothwell would confront lords at Carberry Hill. Although a conflict was on the cards, it quickly dissipated. Bothwell was given safe passage from the field, but Mary was taken back to Edinburgh by the lords. The news quickly spread, and crowds of people gathered. She would be completely denounced, and accused of adultery and murder. The pressures were now weighing heavy on Mary. She was imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, on an island in the middle of Loch Leven. Then between the 20th and 23rd of July she miscarried twins. By the following day Mary was forced into abdication. Her 1-year-old son James would eventually become king, and Moray, her brother, was made regent. As for Bothwell, he was eventually driven into exile in Denmark. The last news of him was that he had become insane, and he died in 1578. One piece of evidence that contributed to Mary's downfall were letters purportedly sent between Mary and Bothwell. They were called the casket letters, and consisted of both general writing and sonnets. The letters were said to hold information about Mary and Bothwell conspiring to the murder, and read quite plainly that Mary had in fact colluded with Bothwell in the plan to assassinate her husband. The letters were dismissed by many as forgeries, and of being used to manipulate the real truth. But Mary fought on. She refused to acknowledge the power of any court to put her on trial, and although an inquiry was to be held at York, Elisabeth refused Mary to attend. The letters were displayed before the commission, held inside a silver gilt casket. Mary argued that her handwriting was not difficult to imitate, but the chair at the inquiry, the Duke of Norfolk, described them as horrible letters and diverse fond ballads. He sent copies to Elisabeth, saying that if they were genuine, they might prove Mary's guilt. Mary's contemporaries said they had no doubt the letters were genuine. Among them was the Duke of Norfolk, who it said secretly conspired to marry Mary in the course of the commission, although he denied it when Elisabeth alluded to his marriage plans, saying he meant never to marry with a person where he could not be sure of his pillow. On the 26th of January 1569, Mary was moved to Tutbury Castle and placed in the custody of the Earl of Shrewsbury and his formidable wife, Bess of Hardwick. It would be around the same time that Elisabeth considered Mary's designs on the English throne to be a serious threat and lengthened Mary's confinement to Shrewsbury's properties. These included Tutbury, Sheffield Castle, Sheffield Manor Lodge, Wingfield Manor, and Chatsworth House. Elizabeth knew now she had to keep Mary at close quarters, yet far enough away for the ongoing case to continue. In May 1569, Elizabeth attempted to mediate the restoration of Mary in return for guarantees of the Protestant religion, but a convention held at Perth overwhelmingly rejected the deal. In 1571 Moray was assassinated. This had coincided with a rebellion in the north of England, led by Catholic earls. It was now Elizabeth had seen and heard enough, and she had become completely convinced that in fact Mary was a major threat. An attempt to replace Elizabeth with Mary with the help of Spanish troops and the Duke of Norfolk was uncovered the same year. It was called the Ridolfi Plot. And for his troubles, Norfolk was executed. The English Parliament now introduced a bill barring Mary from the throne, to which Elizabeth refused to give royal assent. As Elizabeth had another way to discredit Mary further, which was in the publication of the casket letters in London. In 1584, Mary proposed an association with her son, James. This would include her intention to remain in England, but giving up all rights to the throne. Also, she offered to partake in an offensive league against France, and wanted a general amnesty for her homeland of Scotland. She also asked that James be married as long as Elizabeth had knowledge, along with no change to her religion, and to release her from captivity immediately. James sounded it all out and initially agreed to the conditions, but after more thought rejected the proposals and signed a treaty with Elizabeth. This would lead to the abandonment of his mother. For Elizabeth, her trust issues with Mary convinced her to also resist the temptation on offer, as she thought, if released, Mary would continue to conspire and plot further against her. In April 1585, Mary was placed in the stricter custody of Sir Amias Paulet. Then at Christmas, she was moved to a moated manor house at Chartley. On the 11th of August 1586, after being implicated in the Babington plot, a plan to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I, Mary was arrested. She was taken to Tixall Gatehouse. This was an attempt by Walsingham to entrap her, for he had arranged that the casket letters be removed from Chartley, as he was in the process of deciphering the coded text. But it was clear now for all to see, that the letters sanctioned the death of Elizabeth. Mary had nowhere to hide. She was now looking towards the ultimate price she would have to pay. It would be in October that Mary stood trial on the grounds of treason. Mary had always denied any involvement in the conspiracy. When faced with her trials, she said, "Look to your consciences and remember that the theatre of the whole world is wider than the kingdom of England." Her protests were not heard. She claimed to have been denied any opportunity to see the evidence that was offered. She also stated that although on trial, she was not allowed counsel, and finally as a foreign-appointed queen, she could not be convicted of treason. Yet she was convicted on the 25th of October, and sentenced to death, with only one commissioner, Lord Zouche, expressing any form of dissent. Even upon the court order and conviction, Elizabeth was still hesitant in ordering her execution. Her concerns were made over that the killing of a queen could potentially still harm her and discredit her, along with the potential that James, Mary's son, might not be beyond retaliation at his mother's death. After careful thought, on the 1st of February 1587, Elizabeth signed the death warrant and entrusted it to William Davison, a Privy Councillor. On the 3rd of February, 10 members of the Privy Council of England, having been summoned by Cecil without Elizabeth's knowledge, all agreed to carry out the sentence at once. On the evening of February 7, 1587, at Fotheringham, Mary was told her execution was to take place the following day. Her last remaining hours were spent in distributing her belongings to members of her household, and also writing her will, along with a letter to the King of France. The scaffold had been erected in the Great Hall, and draped in black cloth. It was reached by 2 or 3 steps, and furnished with the block, a cushion for her to kneel on, and 3 stools for her, and the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, who were there to witness the execution. The executioner Bull and his assistant knelt before her and asked forgiveness, as it was typical for the executioner to request the pardon of the one being put to death. "It would be then," Mary replied. "I forgive you with all my heart, for now, I hope, you shall make an end of all my troubles." Her servants, Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl, and the executioners helped Mary remove her outer garments. As she disrobed, Mary smiled and said, "I never had such grooms before, nor ever put off my clothes before such a company." She was blindfolded by Kennedy with a white veil embroidered in gold, knelt down on the cushion in front of the block on which she positioned her head, and stretched out her arms. Her last words were, "In manus tuis, Domine, commendo spiritum meum." "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Elizabeth heard of the execution, but was said to be unhappy, as no authority was given to carry it out, and that William Davison, who was in fact the Privy Councillor, should not have gone ahead. But in reality it was quite possibly relief for Elizabeth, as it gave her a plausible excuse to not be involved, and offered denial in avoiding the blood of Mary on her own hands. Davison, who carried out the justice, was arrested, and thrown into the Tower of London, and found guilty of misprision. Luckily for him, he was released 19 months later, after Cecil and Walsingham interceded on his behalf. Mary's request to be buried in France was refused by Elizabeth. Her body was embalmed and left in a secure lead coffin until her burial in a Protestant service at Peterborough Cathedral in late July 1587. Queen Elizabeth I of England died in 1603. She had no children. This meant that Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, also became James I of England, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England. The two parliaments remained separate, and in 1612, James had Mary's body moved to Westminster Abbey, the traditional burial ground for kings and queens. Thank you so much for watching. For more great stories, consider watching one of these videos on your screen right now. And I'll see you again soon here, on the History Roadshow.